Would you pray with me? Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. So when I was in the 8th grade, my family went camping at Lost Maples State Natural Area. Lost Maples is famous for its collection of geographically improbable maple trees, which provide an absolutely stunning display of orange and red and gold and green and brown in the fall. What I remember about that trip is not the beautiful changing leaves, it's the stars. See, Vanderpool, Texas has an average population density of about 1 person per square mile, and the park is unpolluted by city lights. The image I carry with me from that trip is of stepping out of my tent late one night and looking up at the sky. I forgot that I was in the cold and dark, and forgot the reason I got out of my tent in the first place, because I was so overtaken by the stars. Beyond the trees and the rolling hills was this silvery celestial blanket that this Houstonian had never seen before. I've always loved the stars. From my shining star-themed classroom back in the day, to my love of Van Gogh's Starry Night painting, to the Bethlehem Star Pilgrimage tattoo I got in Israel, stars have always been an important symbol for me. And 8th grade me was really into stars. I had Aquarius mapped out on my ceiling in my bedroom in glow stars and string, and I would look at it every night as I was going to bed. Here, I could finally identify my constellation in real life, splayed out across the heavens. I'm, of course, not unique in awe and wonder here. Fascination with the starry sky is innate to human culture and seems like it always has been. There's something about that deep and magnificent display that's been the backdrop of every human life, though somewhat more obscured now with modern lighting. We know that at the time of Jesus' birth, especially to Palestine's east, there was a long-established tradition of seeing heavenly counterparts to events and figures on earth. And thus, an extraordinary event in the sky must have a parallel down here. Before there were cathedrals with soaring ceilings, we had the vault of the heavens. Our own ancient scriptures point to spiritual experiences people have had under the night sky. Think of Abraham looking up and hearing God promise a family uncountable like the stars that he couldn't even imagine. Think of David writing, "When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, what are human beings that you are mindful of them?" The Apostle Paul, in the 1st chapter of Romans, makes the case that every single person has encountered God through the testimony of God's created world. The profound experience of seeing a sky full of stars has inspired an outpouring of spiritual poetry in the psalmist, a smeary impressionist painting in the artist, an intellectual curiosity in astronomers from ancient times to our modern friends at NASA, or a sense of home in voyagers who can read the sky like a map. And one star in particular is central to our celebration of Epiphany. Epiphany is a curious holy day for us. In the middle of the thoroughly Christian celebration of Christmas, we make a special place for characters who were not ever Christians or Jews or even Romans. We go out of our way to point out their otherness. These characters are strangers, foreigners. Matthew doesn't call them royalty, but you can see where we get that connection when we hold that up next to our Isaiah and Psalm passages today, where kings from far away come and bow down and bring gifts. Rather, they practice divination or astrology and astronomy or interpretation of signs, which would put them at odds with some biblical advice and a lot of Christian traditions. They get the most exotic costumes in the pageant. In many elaborate and culturally negligent nativity scenes, they're the only people of color in the story, arriving in Palestine to honor a white baby and his white parents. We can think about that for a minute. But my point is, they aren't part of the dominant culture of the rest of the story's participants. These wise ones from afar don't know Herod's Jerusalem. They look for the newborn king of the Jews in the capital city, expecting that Herod would have already heard the news and not that it would send him into a spiral of murderous jealousy. These visitors break the news to the Jerusalem religious elite that their own Messiah is here, and wait while the learned men consult their scriptures to explain what's going on and where. They then travel to nearby Bethlehem and pay homage to the Christ child. They worship him and they offer gifts fit for royalty. Warned in a dream, they skip Herod's palace on the return trip and leave for their own country on a different road. In Matthew's telling, the only account of the visiting Magi in our canon, nothing indicates that they were changed at all beyond their travel plans. They connected to the truths of the universe through the stars, and they were right. These wise ones, perhaps Zoroastrian priests representing a different monotheistic faith, were drawn to God incarnate through their own beliefs. So is this confirmation that there are many paths to God and Zoroastrians are right? Are these the other flocks Jesus refers to? Of course, the Jewish scriptures were also right, pinpointing the birth location down to a tiny village. Does this story say that others must ultimately bow to Jesus and fit into our salvation story? There's so much to wonder about in this very short text. The message the Magi brought to Herod was political dynamite, as N.T. Wright puts it. The declaration of the kingship of this newborn baby frightened Herod, and it says, and all Jerusalem with him. We know Herod and his advisors knew about this significant birth, and we know the shepherds were in on it. Maybe the innkeeper or inhabitants of the home that welcomed Joseph and Mary. But how was all of Jerusalem upset? Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. reminded us that history is the long and tragic story of the fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. Roman-occupied Jerusalem, under the government of Herod, was the established system, and the religious elite had a lot of the power and privilege. All of Jerusalem represented the many who benefited from this broken system. Even life under a ruler who was willing to enact the slaughter of the innocents was preferable to those in power, to a Messiah who would overturn systems. Theologian Brian Blunt commented that as Martin Luther King knew well, God is often the source of unrest in the universe. God challenges those in power. Today, our psalm praised the King who would reign with righteousness to rescue the poor and crush the oppressor. That's frightening if you're in the seat of power, but it is very good news if you stand with the oppressed. We heard last week about the good news of Jesus, the light of the world. And Epiphany is about that light coming. We heard about the prophecies of John the Baptist, preparing the world for the ministry of the Messiah. These are very rooted in Judeo-Christian tradition. Not that they weren't about to pull up some of those roots, but they were recognizable to the dominant culture. But Epiphany is about outsiders who aren't a part of the Jewish or Christian movements except for this very specific moment. What if, instead of taking this text to mean that outsiders would bow to insiders, we see this as God working through every person who responds to God, regardless of how or where they're called? The strangers get it, while the gatekeepers miss the signs. In Wesleyan words, we talk about prevenient grace, the grace that God gives us before we can even respond back to God. This grace is what enables us to respond to God at all, and it's an unearned gift, just like the gift of Christ, which we celebrate. And unlike what pop Christmas culture would tell us about getting on the nice list to earn your presents, this prevenient grace is poured out by God on all of us first. Hearkening back to the Noah story, with its own sign in the sky, we can see God's covenant intended for all peoples and the whole of the created world. God's predicted yet still surprising entry into the world through Bethlehem is not an exclusively insider event, and that's why there are foreign visitors in the manger scene. The King of the Jews is not just for the Jews. God's saving work was broader. The Magi were invited to this birth using their own understanding of the universe, theology, and their place within it all. They were not asked to convert first, or to renounce the stars as their guide or the oracle dream warnings. And they were moved to offer their gifts and worship to the Christ child. I think the invitation, God's grace given to all, and God's call to the Magi is just the start of the journey, and the end of the story is unwritten because it's a very personal process. I can't say what happened in the spirits of the Magi, but I can take a journey of seeking after God on whatever path God calls me, where God has met me where I'm at first. I love nativity scenes and the way they can teach or retell the story as each character arrives. So when we include the Magi in our nativity scene or in our Christmas through Epiphany celebration, what are we teaching? Take just the gifts of the Magi, the gold, frankincense, and myrrh. What's the point of these gifts? We don't know exactly, but they offer us a lot of discussion starters. Do these symbolically point to Christ's lordship, priesthood, and coming redeeming sacrifice, corresponding to the precious metals, the incense, and the embalming spices? Do we accept Jesus in all these roles? Were these items to be used as currency to support Mary and Joseph as they fled with their child to Egypt? How do we teach about the Holy Family as refugees? And what should we see in their modern equivalents? I learned recently that frankincense and myrrh had medicinal roles in the ancient Near East as anti-inflammatory treatments for postpartum mothers. Could we take a look at our support of maternal health programs with Mary, Mother of God, in mind? We're now in the season of packing up Christmas decorations. After Christmas or after Epiphany or whenever that tradition happens in your household, mine are staying up for quite a while. As the pieces all go back in the box, are we contemplating the Magi's return trip home? We don't hear what happens next. Maybe that's deliberate. Were they returning by a different road in more ways than one, somehow changed by their experience with Christ? I wonder if they noticed 33 years later when this baby king was executed by his own countrymen, or when the resurrected Christ ignited into a movement. On this holy day, in which we celebrate the faithful response of magicians and astrologers who sit outside our faith tradition in a text that doesn't center Christ exactly, what are we looking at? What image can we walk away with? I think of the star that hung above the baby Messiah's first home. The star as an event that declares God's majesty through the natural world. The star as a reminder to seek God's revelation to humanity. The star as a symbol of God's reach beyond our expectations or comprehension. What road are we traveling this year, and who do we seek? Our Seasons of the Spirit curriculum offers this prayer for us all on the journey with Christ today. Prepare us, O God, to welcome the events and the people that mark turning points in our lives. Stir our imaginations to honor the dreams that send us in new directions. Grant us the courage to follow the signs that lead to another road. Amen.